So, welcome everyone. We have an amazing session today. It's about CLM selection, CLM, the stepchild, the red haired child, or whatever other challenging names you want to give it. Maybe it's called challenged lifecycle management. But CLM is one of those impressive solutions that has come up, how to manage your contracts, how to manage your commercial activity in a company, and document it and make sure that you can use it going forward in a productive manner in helping your revenue and helping drop your leakages as a company. But it hasn't come without its challenges. It's a it's not necessarily a new technology, but it's a spin on newer technology. And one more $1 million advice that I'll start with, and then I'll let the panel get introduced, and then we'll talk about more about it. Is the reason we're doing this today is that we hear a lot of challenges, but you're not alone. There have been people who've done this before, so we tried to bring a panel of people who have different perspectives from a corporate buyer perspective, what you should be looking for, what is going to get you success as a company, as an individual, as a legal ops person, or as a procurement person if you are investing into CLM technology. We have the vendor perspective. Hans is going to represent his years and decades of knowledge to talk about that and what will help make a transaction important. And not only just a transaction of buying a solution. CLM could take, this is a relationship you're getting into. What do you need to make it successful? And Gary has been on all of those sides, but today he's playing the role of the consultant who's there to advise you and from his years of experience, kind of bring his golden nuggets to what can make this whole ecosphere of a contract lifecycle management solution acquisition and the journey successful. So, welcome everyone. Thank you very much. If you're joining us at LinkedIn, please feel free to drop your name in the comments. We're going to monitor it. Also, tell us where you're from and some questions that might be on your mind. Let me start with the introductions. I would not be able to do justice to both these gentlemen on the screen, Daniel Dzialga and Hans Bengard. Daniel has an illustrious career on the commercial side and the commercial legal side. And he also at some point picked up the challenging side of legal operations. So he's also delved into legal IT, legal operations, all in the quest of making legal functions successful. So Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks. So I've been playing around with technology for over 20 years and really trying to find solutions that will help solve problems. So anything from AI to CLM to trademarks, just figuring out easier ways to get things done faster.
Wonderful. And Dan's, I can't even cover everything, but Dan's sort of delved into the technology side of it. But in talking to him in the past few days, preparing for this, I hear a sense of how he sort of looks at it very strategically, not just technology as a piece, but how's it going to give you success. And so the flip side of that, Hans, I've known Hans for probably as many years as he's been in this industry, although I'm much younger than Hans. But Hans, tell us about your experience and how have you seen this industry evolve as well?
Easy on the decades, Danish. Well, it's great to be here. I'm a recovering lawyer who decades is fair enough. Decades ago, got bitten by the technology bug and helping businesses, helping business partners, helping Dan and people like Dan through the use of technology and working not just with technology, but how technology supports processes and the people that sit in those processes and use the technology. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
That's a great introduction, Hans, and we'll get into it more. I also have with me Gary Wheeler, my partner in crime in these webinars that we've been putting together. So, Gary, tell us about your experience in this CLM space. You've started companies. You were very early on to this AI action. So, give us a quick introduction.
Thank you, Danish, and rest of the panel. So glad to be here with you today. For what's relevant for this webinar today, I think it's important that participants realize that I've been in their shoes if they're on the corporate side, very much like Dan. I don't have the law degree, so I don't have that aspect of it. But I have I have been purchasing and assessing all kind of different legal technology as an insider at a corporation for a good bit of my career. And then I switched over to the other side and went into the consulting. So I've got the chance to do that many times again. So I've been there, done that multiple times, and really always enjoy working with clients, helping them, very much like Dan said, solve problems. That's really what I'm all about. How do I solve the problems? How do I make their lives better? From that perspective of using, in this case, CLM, assessment selections, but also AI is a big part of that. We're going to start talking a little bit about that today. And that's my quick introduction. I'll turn it back over to our facilitator and fantastic host, Danish, to tell a little bit about
you. Thank you, Gary. Thank you. I was waiting for that. Thank you very much, everybody who's joining us and who might be watching this as a recording. I've been in this industry like this panel early on when legal operations and operational excellence became a buzzword for legal and commercial organizations. And I've been really helping the Office of General Counsel and Office of Commercial Leaders help achieve strategic and operational excellence. And sometimes that's through transformation, sometimes that's looking through specific challenges like managing contracts or managing spend and so on. With that, a quick plug about the platform that is helping us bring this to you, Swiftwater and Company. We are a small, swift, nimble, and flexible, trusted set of advisors. We really believe in the 7 C's, about connecting, caring, and collaborating with clients, partners, in the ecosystem. And with that, we create solutions, and we want to be courageous. We're always curious, and we want to have the confidence to create something new. And so as we help the C-suite, whether you're the top person in your organization on the commercial side or the legal side, or whether you're part of the team in the legal operations or an attorney, we want to help you be successful. So today's topic is really going through the 3 perspective of contract lifecycle management solution selection. You can see Dan in his role of the corporate buyer, the person who ultimately needs to be successful, who has an organization at his back, to relying on getting this tool and really getting the benefits of it. The vendor who's bringing everything together, and then the consultant who's there to advise you or help you with the gotchas. Anybody who's in this organization, in any enterprise organization, whether you're $1 billion plus or $1 billion below, everybody's wearing multiple hats. So you do need some additional help in certain areas. And before we jump in, I'll start with what I alluded to, the $1 million advice. Contract lifecycle management is not a tool. It is a set of tools. You can buy it as a platform from certain vendors, but it is a set of different tools that help you along. But I will not be doing justice to that. Hold on to that advice because the panel has got some great ideas. I will turn it on to Gary to talk a little bit about CLM and how, in his experience, CLM has been really, what is CLM? How do we look at CLM? What is contract management? What does the life cycle look like? What you should be thinking of?
Thank you. So because we have a wide audience today, a lot of people probably are familiar with CLM, but we thought we'd quickly cover some of the basics and walk through that before we get to the meat of what we're covering today. So what exactly is it? Contract lifecycle management. A lot of people probably work with contracts. They used to work with contract management systems, but contract lifecycle management is managing contracts through their entire life cycle, from cradle to grave, as we like to say, and all aspects of that after the fact, including renewal, expiration, and really mining the data within that as well, managing through that entire life cycle. Danish, you want to go to the next slide? Because I'm gonna buzz through these things quickly. The next one we're going to see is a little bit more about what I was just talking about, the contract lifecycle management itself. And for the purposes of what we're covering today, we're primarily talking about enterprise size companies, although it will relate to small and medium-sized companies as well. But we're typically talking to companies that are in the billions of dollars in revenue and up. because they typically have a broader need with different subsidiaries and divisions and more complex needs. And that's really what we're going to primarily discuss today. But you get through all of that cycle, everything from the legal intake process to the drafting and creating of the contract to the negotiation, which is where the lawyers really get involved back and forth with the counterparties, and then doing the review of that contract, the internal approval of it, and then actually executing it, getting it electronically signed in most cases these days, ultimately storing it into your system, and then going through monitoring and then renewals and expirations and terminations. Is a lot of those are some of the real value propositions, and then the whole cycle just starts again. So it's the complete life cycle when we talk about CLM. Every vendor doesn't offer every aspect of that. All the big enterprise vendors have all these parts to it. There's tons of other solutions that only have one or two or three of these parts to it.
Hey Gary, and let me just stop you for a second here, because I think this is a very simple yet very powerful image when you're talking about listening to the stakeholders and leaders that are involved in a project. Um, this and images like it help you listen and help you uncover what's important to continue to, as you're going down and preparing for a project, prepare for your list of what's important to the organization. And from a vendor perspective, helps us learn what's important for that organization. And like you say, not every vendor will have every part covered.
All right, well, let's jump into some of the when I think about CLM, my mind always goes to what are the benefits. Okay, so, or any solution for that matter, not just CLM, but any solution. It's always good to think about the business case and what are the key benefits. And sometimes those are not as obvious as they look on the surface. I'm not going to go through all of those. You see them on the screen. A lot of people, surprisingly to me, they forget about probably the biggest benefit: having a consolidated contract repository to store all of your contracts in. And if you use e-signature, automatically bringing those back in. That, along with reporting and dashboards and ability to mine that data and all the other things you see on your screen, those are just some of the major benefits, but it all boils down to improving efficiency of operations for this benefit. The next benefit that you'll see, which is the second big category, is more related to reducing the risk and enhancing compliance, something that all lawyers love, right, Dan?
One thing, Gary, when you're thinking about CLM and the acquisition of a CLM and the money that's going to be spent, you want to think about ROI. And one of the things that you have here that I think I'd like to emphasize is around the renewals and expirations. When I implemented a CLM at my last job, I worked with Hans on it. And in 1 year, in the second year after the application was launched, in that single year, we saved the company $2.5 million. And it was all around tracking renewals and expirations, because those things automatically renewed and the company didn't know that they were renewing. And it gave because they had a good tracking of that, you were able to say, hey, we don't need that many licenses for this renewal, or we don't even need that service anymore. So I think that if your company doesn't have a good handle on managing renewals and expirations, this is a great way to say to your GC, hey, this is a way we could save the company 6 figures or more.
And I've also had plenty of other examples I can give as well. But we're gonna jump into the reducing risk and enhancing compliance. This is something that the legal department specifically always is very concerned about, and rightfully so. That's part of their major objective of legal, is to do these things. So yes, CLM can actually benefit you in this, and part of that is having consistency across your contracts is one of the ways you can do that, and the CLM solution helps you to do that. Making sure you get all the contracts signed. I've been with organizations that they're working off of contracts that never got fully signed and executed. As something as simple as that goes. Trying to make sure that take place in smaller and medium-sized companies, that happens a fair amount as well. And then really working with governance and audit capabilities, you just have so much more data and information to look at and to analyze, and that's becoming more and more important when you're looking at that big mass of all your contracts, not just individually, but the sum total. there's just a tremendous amount of data in there that you can look at and analyze and use to improve your contract language over time, to improve strategic business decisions that you may be making. And that's something I don't see that many companies really getting to that level to talk about. So actually, we'll talk about that when the next slide, when we get into the maturity model. I always like to have people think about the different levels as you go through the maturity. You start off, depending on where you're coming from, you may have already had a contract management system, or maybe even another CLM solution that now you want to upgrade to something better, or you could be coming from paper. I recently worked a couple of years ago with a Fortune 500 company that's completely coming from paper, had never had a solution in place. So getting that bottom layer, getting that repository, that consolidated repository, is really the key stepping stone. And of course, a lot of people find that out how important that was in COVID times. So they could go in there and find their contracts, look at them anytime they could remotely. The second stage is really doing what I said a while ago, looking at that data that's in there, starting to do some basic reporting and analytic. The third part is really jumping in and understanding the authoring and negotiation aspect, and that's where the lawyers really start looking at the key components of the tool, how it can use to help with the red lines and modifications and edits and changes. Most everybody gets to those three stages fairly quickly. And then the fourth one is doing integrations with your ERP or sales solutions or other systems. A lot of people think about that up front, they plan for it, and then they implement it in different stages. The top level, quite frankly, is where I see very few companies getting to. They may get to the edge of that, but I don't really see them taking full advantage of all that massive amount of data they have in their contracts, which is the lifeblood of their organization, and really diving into and exploring that information and using it to make key, critical, strategic business decisions. Dan gave it a good example a while ago of how they could save millions of dollars by just handling the renewals and expirations. But I've also seen it millions of dollars, especially in a large company where procurement in one division wasn't sharing any information with another division, and they started sharing some key contract information and able to do a lot better negotiations because the left hand and the right hand weren't synchronizing, and they saved millions of dollars doing that. So there's a lot of opportunity there to think through all those different stages. You don't have to get to the top level to begin with. You start and you work your way up. What's important to your organization? Okay, next slide, Donna, because I said I was going to go through these fast, so I am. One of the key points I'm laying out here is, and I'm pretty sure Hans and Dan would also agree with me here, there's a lot of prep work that you really need to do ahead of time before you actually think about implementing your solution or even the selection process. That's part of the advantage of a selection, or I also call it an assessment, of your internal process, your internal operations. And according to this study that was done by InnoLaw, 48% of organizations have what they call foundational improvements to make before implementing CLM. Most of that, I would say, is around processes, really knowing your current processes, knowing what works well, knowing what doesn't work well. And when you go to a CLM system, you're almost flipped to scale. The things that you do on the back end, typically in a manual type driven process, you're moving much more to the front end when you implement CLM. What do I mean by that? You're typically having templates to create contracts, and you're having business users who are going in and they're entering that information in right up front to collect that data to even start the process before it's handed over to an attorney or in-house lawyer to look at to start the negotiations and the process from there. So that's a big change that a lot of people don't think about when they're coming from a manual system especially. There's plenty of other process changes that also need to occur. And while I'm hitting that, I talked about it briefly a while ago. What is an enterprise class CLM solution? There's literally over 100 CLM solutions out there. Okay, we've done the research on it, we've worked on it, and a lot of those are what I would say were more for medium and small size organizations. The ones you see on the screen here is what we generally, when we're talking to clients, what we talk to the top 10 or 12 or 13 companies that are enterprise class. What sets them apart from a lot of the other solutions is generally they cover that complete life cycle. every aspect of it. Maybe not legal intake. Some of them have a different solution for that because there's other things besides working with contracts that occurs there. But maybe they have a separate package that you integrate with it. But every other aspect they have. And when you get to enterprise class, you do have to have more complexity around subsidiaries and divisions and things like access control and security and all the different granular levels you have to manage that. That's where you start seeing these enterprise class start being worth their money. And if you don't have all those, you may not need this type of solution. But these are some of the biggest. Not all of them are recommended, by the way, or listed, I should say. And Hans may want to jump in here on this, on some of the bigger solution providers out there. But I will tell you, two of them up here, Onnit and Malbec, aren't on some of, and I'm just drawing a blank right now on the industry, Forrester, they don't list those two companies in there, and those are two excellent companies that pretty much most companies should consider. There is no one right solution for every organization. The right solution is what fits for you and what works well for you. Almost all of these solutions have a lot of different comparable features and functions. It's all about how do they work, where are their really strengths at, how does that fit to your environment? And Dan's going to jump into that in just a minute, and the importance of a scorecard, to really get into that, and also the look and feel of the solutions and even integrations. What are you planning? All those things become a key factor into which one is the best solution for you. And with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn it over to the man of the hour, Mr. Dan here, and let us get his perspective since he's going through CLM selections and tell us what he thinks is important.
Yeah, happy to do that. So just to give everyone background, I've looked at, been in the market at least 3 times to look for CLMs over the past 3.5 years. So I'm very familiar with all the market players, both the big companies and the small companies. And I just want to share some of my thoughts on this. So as Gary pointed out in the beginning, I think getting prepared before you go into the market and starting conversations with your vendors is absolutely critical. And here's a couple things that I think you all should think about before you start picking up the phone and calling your first CLM vendor. Number one is, what are the problems you're trying to solve for? And I think here you want to be really specific. Like, hey, we have a problem. We generate a lot of contracts on our paper, and the lawyers are getting the information from the clients, and it's incomplete, and they're ending up having to go back and forth to get the information, to get the contracts out. Or you're a sell-side agency, and you're trying to get your sales agreements generated faster. At my old job, we worked on third-party paper. We did very little contracts on our old paper. So understanding what that problem is that we were trying to solve for, of how do we get those contracts through the system faster and optimize the legal review so that our business can get the services that they need. So really identifying what are the problems that you're trying to solve for. The second thing is, once you've got those problems that you're trying to solve for, you want to develop a scorecard. And the reason why the scorecard is important is it's going to keep you focused when you're in the conversations with your CLM vendors. And because what's going to happen is your CLM vendors are going to try to, push the features and the functionalities that they think are important and help differentiate them from their competitors. So they might start talking to you about AI and using AI to review contracts or data extraction. Well, if that's not important to you, then you want to be, your scorecard reflects that. Then you can say to the vendor, hey, we're not interested in that. Let's focus on what we're interested in. So let me give you a contrast of what our scorecard was. Like when I was at Red Ventures, as I mentioned, most of our contracts were on third-party paper. So there we said, hey, contract assembly is not that important to us. Whereas at Mattel, the company I'm currently at, we do 70% of our deals are on our paper. Not only that, our contracts have lots of tables in it. So I needed to make sure that the vendors could accommodate tables and adding, 5 rows to one contract and 10 rows to another contract and 20 rows to another contract. And oftentimes we negotiate those contracts with vendors, and then we want to reduplicate that same contract, not our template, but the negotiated contract with the vendor. So those are kind of things that you want to put on your scorecard. So again, are you're going to generate a lot of contracts, or are you going to review a lot of contracts? The other thing is like, are we concerned about timing and how fast something gets through the cycle? Like, how long does it take legal to review? Do we want to track that? Is that important? For us at Mattel, one of the things that was important is like, where is the contract in its life cycle? It's bouncing around. I've got 50 deals that I'm negotiating, and I don't know which ones are on my plate versus my business plate versus a third party. Those are the kind of things that you want to say, hey, that's an important thing. That's a problem that we're going to solve. We want to make sure that we focus the vendor. We want to put that on our scorecard and share that with the thing. The other thing I would say is that you before you start talking to vendors, you want to align on how you want to launch your product. So do you want to do full enterprise, which I would discourage, or do you want to do a crawl, walk, run approach to it, where you start out with NDAs and maybe one other group, and then you scale the platform over time? The other thing is I think you want to set expectations with your general counsel and the decision makers. What you want to say here is, hey, we believe the CLM is going to drive efficiency and allow lawyers and paralegals to practice at the top of their license and eliminate some administrative tasks. But we don't know that until we test that hypothesis. And we might go into the market and we may pick this vendor, and the vendor, after 2 or 3 years, the vendor might not be the perfect fit, but you're going to learn a lot from that will allow you to be a more discerning buyer the next time you go into the market. So again, I think you want to make sure that you're under promising your general counsel, but you're going to over deliver is really the point on setting expectations. And then the final thing I would say is that you really, as Gary pointed out, you want to really flow chart what your current state is. Because in doing that, what it's going to allow you to do is say, hey, here's some breakages here, and this is what we need to do and to optimize our efficiency. This is a good example of a flow chart that I built for our NDA process, where it maps out like, okay, an email is going to fire at this point, and then the document's going to go here, and this is how the system's going to update to the different phases and the stages. So you want to kind of map that out as to what you think your workflow is going to want to be, and then share that with your CLM provider so that they can kind of say, oh, well, we see how you want to do it. Our system can accommodate that. Or they're going to be able to say, no, our system won't be able to do that. Or here's how we're going to solve the reconciliation stage. Danish, you maybe can skip to the next slide. So then when you get to the selections and you've done your homework, your prep work, now when you go to select a vendor, what I would recommend is going to one of the shows that you have. So Clock has a show in Vegas, there's a show in New York City, there's several shows throughout. The benefit of going to a show is it gets you out of your office and allows you to meet with a lot of vendors in a very, very short period of time. And what you can do is you're going to be able to like knock out a bunch of people saying, hey, that guy doesn't have great, they don't do contract assembly very well. I'm going to move on. I don't like the UI on that. I'm not going to talk to that person. And you're going to find some people that you really do like. And I think traveling to a conference is a really great way to see a lot of vendors in a very, very short period of time. Connect with others or hire a consultant. So, people like myself that have been in the market, I'm happy to take anybody's phone call and give you my 2 cents on the vendors and what the market is. But I think you can talk to, other peers, other people that are in legal operations and ask them what their opinions are about the CLM products that they have. If you don't, I would tell you, you got to hire a consultant if you really don't have someone on your legal team that can devote a significant amount of time to this. When you're in the process of doing selection and the build process, that person on your team needs to be able to dedicate at least 20 hours a week on this project during that build. The build is generally about a 10 to 12 week process if you start small. But during that period of time, you got to be like, this has to be your most important thing. And if you don't have that, that's when a consultant comes in. The other thing is that a consultant's done this 2 or 3 or a dozen or 100 of times. So they're going to be able to kind of give you best practices, because sometimes the vendors are just going to say, we'll do whatever you want to do, whatever you want. But the consultant's going to say, maybe that's not the best way of doing that. And, so in my job, I didn't use a consultant because I felt very comfortable with the experience and the lessons I've learned the hard way to not hire a consultant. But man, if you've never done this before, I would say it's well worth the time to find a consultant. Record the demos. Very simple. You're going to forget what one vendor does versus another. So recording those vendors and coming back, and being able to watch those videos afterwards is super important. Be careful of eye candy. again, this goes back to a comment I made earlier. Vendors are going to want to show you what their features, functionality. There are a lot of them are going to talk about AI and say, hey, this is what we can do with AI. But if that, go back to your scorecard. If AI is not important on your scorecard, then don't weight too heavily, what the vendor can do, because there's a lot of really cool technology, but if you don't use it, that shouldn't be part of your decision-making process. And then the final is keep two in the mix. And what I mean by that is when you get to this point when you're going to make a decision, kind of keep two vendors in line of saying, hey, I'm going to either pick this one or this one, but I'm not really sure. And the reason why is like when you go to negotiate the financials and the licenses and all the other terms, when you got two people online, they're going to try to match each other's offer. They're going to say, oh, I'll do that as if they're doing that. So you're going to be able to play each other off. Each other, and I think you're just going to get a better deal as a result of that. Danish, if you want to skip to the last slide, no.
The point number 5 is where experience comes in, then, right?
Yeah.
Make sure you always have a backup. Things don't always work out.
So, is that you also with this technology, I would say to you, you want to buy, but you're also thinking that you may move to a different platform in a few years. And so, I like to say to people, if it's your first one, think of it as dating, not marriage. Especially with CLM vendors. So it's in this guy, and that kind of brings to my point, is start small in every way. And when I think about that, is start small is let's not go enterprise and we're going to do every contract for the entire legal department. We're going to do NDAs and 1 or 2 other agreements. Keep the team small. The selection team should be really small, 5 people. The more cooks that you get in the kitchen, the longer it's going to take to make decisions. Other people are going to do it. You got to be stubborn to say, this is my vision. This is what I want to do. When you're in the execution, you want to market. So name your product. Don't call it Malbec. Don't call it Agiloft. Don't call it Onnit. Call it something that's relevant to your business. Brand your product that's relatable to your company. Find a cheerleader. That cheerleader may be a lawyer on the team. It may be a client that's just going to say, hey, this is a fabulous product. Let me get other people in the organization excited about it. And give out really good swag, because you give out a good hoodie that's got your brand product on it. People are going to want that at work and say, what is that? And then they're going to start asking questions, and you're going to help with that change management. Believe it or not, a $30 sweatshirt goes a long way of getting people to adopt it. And then the other thing I would say is minimal viable product, MVP. You want to start out small, like, Gary had mentioned integrations, moving data from, a DMS into the system. I wouldn't do all that stuff. Like, see if you're going to get the lawyers and paralegals and the clients doing that before you start migrating hundreds and thousands of contracts into the system. Like, start out small. Don't worry about integrations until you really are, that people are going to adopt the solution. So that's why I think you got to keep it small, start out simple, and really execute, and then just constantly being evolving. That's all I got to say on those slides, Danish.
That's wonderful. You kind of brought that change management aspect into it. Even a small activity goes a long way, because ultimately what you want to do is make sure people accept it and adopt it for the longer run. So what we'll do is switch gears a little bit. I know all of you want to talk about AI, and we have a slide about AI, but I'm going to give Hans and Gary an incentive. If they can finish in time, then we'll keep AI for the last, because I think that's where we can end up with what really works, what really isn't working, because all of you have been through practical advice or practical situations. So I would love to hear from your angle as we end this. But it's a good transition into, Hans, would you like the procurement experience where somebody comes in and tells you, it's like, hey, this is what is it there in the documentation, you give me a price and I'll negotiate and then we'll talk to you? Or is there a better approach out there? Because this is, CLM, like it or not, is not like a point solution. It's an enterprise tool. It has big consequences. So what's the best way from a vendor's perspective that you would expect to be engaged?
Yeah, I think you said the magic word there with engagement, Danish. If you're working with something as broad reaching as CLM, then you do need to engage on a deeper level than just let's trade checklists of features and functions. And I'm not saying that scorecard that Dan mentioned is unimportant by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I would encourage I would encourage the customers out there, anyone who's looking and speaking with vendors, to at least at some level share their scorecard, because what we really want to know from a vendor's perspective is, what's important to you? How are you measuring success? What are the important components of that success? What's a must-have versus a nice-to-have versus, a throwaway? So sharing that kind of information, I think, is critical. Obviously, I think a lot of customers could get very cynical about this and think, well, if I share some of that information, really the vendor's just going to end up trying to tell me what I want to hear. Okay, they're certainly selecting a CLM is a little more complex than that. I think if you really engage with the vendors, you're going to get past that type of dialogue very quickly. But what it allows you to do if you're a customer is really test those parts of a CLM offering that are going to be most important. Because I think, as Dan said, you don't want to get distracted by eye candy. And if a vendor has none of that information about alignment, they're going to go out of the box with you with their eye candy, with what they believe generally is the biggest differentiator for their solution. So, that all goes to scoping, gathering information, what to share. We can talk a little bit more about use cases later, but I think almost all of my successful engagements with customers have included the sharing of use cases. That requires a good bit of work on the customer's perspective, by the way, because they have to go out, they have to collect, they have to do some documentation. A lot of this just isn't available before a CLM selection takes place. So it becomes part of the project, and a place where, for example, discovery and the help of a consultant is terrific and really does lend value, because then you can take each vendor through those critical use cases. Almost all vendors will have an answer, by the way, to almost any use case you could throw at them. But the distinction is, how do they handle your use case? Because that can be very important. That really flips down to point number 3 on this slide. When you're thinking about what is the future of CLM, which again, vendors, it's very tempting for some vendors when they speak to you, it shows or otherwise, to pontificate about the future of CLM and where they are going, where CLM is going, and how they align with the future of CLM, which could be great. But what is the future of your CLM at your company? Keep the two of you, by the two of you, I mean, and I'm going to include the 3 of you here. If you're including a consultant, keep all 3 of you aligned on what the future of your CLM is going to be. And we can go to, one more point. I'm sorry, number 2, I skipped. My apologies. When you are talking about alignment and what you would have the vendor not only demonstrate to you, but discuss with you, try to align with you on. Alignment, again, we've said it over and over again, critical. Tick and tie your scorecard to those objectives. And you should do this consistently, by the way, not just during an initial, let's show up and have our key stakeholders review a first or a second demonstration of the CLM vendor. Do that almost every time you have an engaging or longer than 5-minute conversation with a vendor. Maybe even then, make sure you can tie what the vendor tells you. If there's something important coming your way across in that meeting or phone call, tie what they said to one of your objectives. If you can't, ignore it. Don't kick the bulldog on the side of the road as you're marching towards your objective. But be open to value that you may not have considered. Dan and I talked about this, I don't know, I guess a couple of years ago, Dan, and we were talking about a CLM implementation, and I was sharing how it was a very important part of the solution that I was presenting that involved keeping everyone in a contract process together with an internal chat and sharing function. that aligned that. Sorry, I'm overusing the word alignment, but stored that conversation together with the life of a particular contract. I said, your users will love it. It actually will support adoption. And I think it turned out being kind of an eye-opener, because that's what happened. But initially, we really didn't think that was going to be a critical component to the overall selection. So what are the secrets of success? I don't know that these are necessarily secrets. I love Dan's advice on, save keep two in the mix, two vendors in the mix during your selection process. Let them play off of one another to get the best deal. Absolutely. But you need to also understand, everybody does, that vendors will not all have the same licensing model. Most vendors have, per seat licensing in play in some sort of way, but the seats may differ. They may be distinguished from one another, and certainly their pricing can be distinguished from one another. And almost all enterprise vendors will have leeway in the pricing. So again, why is that important? Obviously, getting your best deal, but make sure you've done your homework in collecting the information about who is going to be using the CLM, and not just who right out of the gate, but who, if you're rolling this out in phases, who is going to be using the CLM as you march toward, the end of year 1, year 2, and year 3. Also, again, this is to Dan's point, not everything about the full lifecycle management of CLM and a CLM offering is going to be very important for your organization. Why is that important in pricing? Because lots of CLM vendors, or I should say many, will price according to modules. So it's important for you to understand that as a customer up front. It's also very important for the vendor to understand that up front, and for the two of you to be marching in sync on, well, what components of my solution from a vendor perspective are going to be important to helping you succeed as a customer. Danish, you look like you want to interject.
Yeah, no, I think the theme that I'm getting, and I'm happy to take any more input from the rest of the panel as well, is that we're just talking about selection. We haven't even thought about implementation yet. But there seems to be the readiness, or the preparation that needs to be done is a little bit more than just saying, hey, I need, just an e-signature software, or I need something that is very point solution. What I'm hearing is, because it's going to affect different people, you need a lot of adoption. You need to select the right tools. You need to have the right features. You need to be, the more prepared you are, the better this experience would look like, even as you step into implementation.
I would say you have to be careful with that, though, Danish, because I think if you talk to too many people, you're going to get paralyzed, and that's not good either, right? So what I think when you're evaluating a CLM, what you do want to do is account for your immediate use cases, but also know that you've asked the questions that as you scale it, the tool is robust enough to grow and accommodate different workflows that different lawyers and business people are going to need. So, and again, it's just the same thing. Like, hey, we're not going to integrate with any other applications like Coupa or other pieces of technology like Salesforce, but we want to make sure that they have robust APIs that we can make those connections if we want to. So I think it's a really, it's a balancing act, because if you get too much into the weeds on your current process, you literally will just grind to a halt, and you'll spend years evaluating your current state, and you'll never get your CLM implemented too.
That's a very valid point. And I think you set up, and that's when you call Gary, right? It's like, hey, give me the shortcut.
Everything you're saying, Dan, is I've seen every bit of that, so that is a problem, because most companies do not have an excellent resource like you internal to them that has the legal background, but also has the legal technology and is used to working with systems and project management, all those other aspects, because these truly are enterprise solutions that affect almost always procurement, sales, legal, IT, all these other functional areas, and that's where things get really complicated because you're not just dealing with one department or one area, you're dealing across the entire enterprise and trying to get the right solution, and none of them fit every one of those functional groups just perfect. So that's where a consultant can come in and help figure out what's most important to you now and in the future as well. And that's when you really should consider bringing a consultant. When I was internal, we had a fantastic IT organization that worked very good with our legal organization. We had done many projects and project management. We knew all about the selection process, but we didn't know all about CLM. So we brought in consultants because they've been there, done it lots of different times, and their value can be worth their weight in gold. Even if you have good internal people and know what they're doing, they don't necessarily know the applications and all that comes with that. So one of the things that I think Hans and Dan both mentioned was use cases. This is where I find the rubber starts really meeting the road as you're going through that selection process, coming up with what I call scripted scenarios. Okay, what does that mean? That just means you have your very well defined use case. Maybe there's 2 or 3 that you've determined are really important to your organization. And that's when you've already done your down selection. So maybe 3 or 4 or 5 vendors that you have that you want to go through and do the use case on, because that's where you really see what's relevant to your company and to your organization and how that vendor solution is going to meet your needs, because they have to go off and spend time and configure it. They've got to set it up using, I actually use your company's contracts so that they can see the workflow, the process, and how it works. You don't want to make it too overburdened on the CLM vendor, because they'll spend a fair amount of time on this, So you want to be very careful what you select, but it's usually what starts really separating companies, because what I found is many people on that selection team and other people that are secondary, they can't really fully understand and grasp just what they see in a standard demo. They have to see how it relates to them and to their company and to their organization. So scripted scenarios are great for that once you've done your down selection. Dan's already mentioned it, coming up with that selection criteria and the cost considerations that come into play. I've got a couple slides on that I'll cover in just a minute in more detail. Some of the secrets to the success, we've covered a lot of stuff already, but I'll add, can never forget about change management. And even in the selection process, that is huge. Even the sweatshirts that Dan mentioned, it's huge to start laying the right groundwork for your implementation. And what's in it for me? That's what everybody really wants to know. What's in it for me? How's it going to help me if I'm a lawyer? How's it going to help me if I'm procurement? How's it going to help me if I'm over here in IT? You really have to think about every one of those different groups and organizations and how it's going to help them and the benefits that are related to that particular person or that particular department or that particular functional area. We've mentioned before, a lot of people completely forget about their legacy contract migration, especially if they're coming from a paper-based solution. But even if they're coming from another solution, you may not want to do it all at once, like Dan said. But if you do, it can be a significant cost consequence to bring. If you've got 5,000 contracts, probably not a big deal. But if you got 20, 30, 40,000, I've worked with 100,000. It's a big deal to bring all those contracts over and get them cleaned up and ready and brought into the new system. And usually it is done in phases. And it's not just a cost. It's a lot of time and effort. There's some great new tools out there, by the way, that helps from an AI that's really helping to reduce the cost here, but it's still a fair amount of work. And something you need to consider as part of your decision process, either through the vendor you're working with or through a consultant or through another party, but you at least need to think about it from your 2 to 3 year type plan from a cost and time perspective. And then you've got, who's going to define and own and manage the system? It seems like it'd be a simple answer to that, but I can guarantee you it is not a simple answer. Sometimes it's legal, sometimes it's IT in combination with them, sometimes it's procurement, sometimes it's a mix of all those. And I know we're right out of time, so I'm going to stop there, Dan, Danish, and let us wrap up with some final closing comments, or see if there's any really burning questions that we got to hit. And as we're going through that, maybe you can flip through the last couple of slides as we cover those.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of good material in here. We will make sure that everybody who registered for the webinar and attended it can receive all of this information. It's been provided by Dan, Hans, Gary, from years of experience in terms of what you should have in your criteria list, your considerations, org structure and challenges and benchmarks. But most importantly, we have our panel is available. Here's the information to contact them. If you want to reach out to Dan, Hans, Gary, myself, we're all here. Like Dan said at the start, don't go it alone. There's a lot of information available in the industry. Even if you just need some therapy or some advice, please feel free to reach out. What I'll do in the closing section is maybe give each of you 60 seconds, starting Dan, then Hans, and then Gary. Go ahead, give us some thoughts about, let's talk about success, right? I mean, what do you need? What do you ultimately need for success?
I would say two things just on that is it goes back to my alignment point is align with your GC on how you define success. And I think that could be how many users are we going to get signed up to the service? How many contracts are we going to push through the service? What do we want to sunset? Like we've got other applications, a document management system that we could sunset for this. So I think just, really finding concrete things that you can work with your general counsel on and saying, here are things that we can identify that if we do this, we've achieved success.
Hans, I mean, from a vendor's perspective, I mean, the question I always want to ask is, how do you lead me to success? So what's your point of view on that?
Yeah, well, my point of view on that is you need to be a great listener and really work to engage with your customer. And sometimes great listening does require some talking and a lot of Q&A to dig out what's really going to be important for them. We've used the term success a lot, but if you're going to align with your customer on success, you need to measure that kind of consistently. One example that comes to mind is if you're in selection, which sometimes selection processes can drag on, make sure that you keep the launch plan and how the launch plan impacts anticipated success in mind. Because if you get to a point where you're just going to miss or overshoot and not deliver on the success for your customer, that's good for none of us.
Perfect. And so, Gary, from my perspective, the question that now we get is not, I need a CLM system. It's like, I need a solution for contracts. How do you get me to success? What do you suggest?
I think it's a good point saying solution, because that's really what it is. It is not just a piece of technology. Okay, so you're going to go through some transformation in your organization to do this and to be successful with it. You've got to have alignment, like we've all discussed. And I wouldn't be a good consultant if I didn't say you didn't have to think about people, process, and technology, because all three of those come into play, especially the people side. Really understanding all the people and the players and who's going to get involved and help make it successful, and what are their needs. To make sure we're clear on that. But processes is just as important, and then the technology is the solution as well. We actually added a fourth component to that. We call it the organizational component, because this is where I see a lot of organizations fail. You really got to take into account your culture, your structure of your organization, your leadership structure itself, who's going to own the CLM system, and can't ever forget about budget. Not just the current budget, but 3 or 4 or 5 years out as you plan that kind of. What we recommend is that phased approach that Dan mentioned. Plan it out, organize it, and roll it out in appropriate phases for your organization for what makes sense. And ultimately, making sure whatever you define internally is successful, that's your goal. That's what you want to hit.
Perfect. I mean, this was a great session. I know we can go on and on, but unfortunately, we'll have to cut it short. But this has been awesome. We got feedback from 3 different perspectives, a lot of information. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And we'll make sure that's available to everybody. Again, reach out for any questions. We are here. We did not talk about AI today. That is a burning topic, but we will make sure that next time we get together, we either record it or we do another live session and take questions from people of what's working in AI and what's not. For now, thank you very much. Goodbye.